name is Leon Wigrizer. I'm going to talk about the early lives of my grandparents when they came over here on my father's side. My grandmother's name was Polly Sussman Wigrizer, and she married Harry Wigrizer. And they came over here when my father was about 3 years old. And they came from the Ukraine, from Vilna Gubernia. Gubernia means a village, and Vilna was the name of the city. So that's where they were from. And they came over here, and my grandmother lived a pretty good life, but she came from a, for those days, wealthy family. And she got into a fight with my grandfather about the stove. I have no idea if it's true. I don't know what caused it. But she picked up my father and she moved back to Russia to live with her parents. And while they were in Russia, the pogroms started. And the Cossacks from all the areas used to come through and just kill the Jews with knives. They would cut off their heads and leave them. They split my father's head open, and he had a scar on his head till he died. And the family brought him back in the house and built a fake wall. And they kept him between the two walls so that nobody would know he's there, and fed him and nursed him. When my grandmother was away, my grandfather got together with a woman who lived in the same apartment house. There's always been a question of whether or not they ever got married. But she had 3 children with Harry: Izzy, Abe, and Leona. We don't know exactly how Harry Wagner became Harry Wagner, because his name was Wigrizer all along. But somewhere along the line, he took the name Wagner and just used it. And as I said before, and I still think I'm right, that there's no record of him ever marrying Rose. Izzy became a multimillionaire. He was a real sharp guy, and he was very, very well politically. And he was able to do a lot and keep the state and the city up. So he went into bag business. In fact, they wrote a book about him, From Bags to Riches. He took old-fashioned burlap bags and repaired them and sold them. And then later he went into the burlap bag business. And along the way, as he made money, he donated money to build 3 theaters in Salt Lake. The Rose Wagner Theater after his mother, the Leona Wagner Theater after his sister, and the Janae Wagner Theater after his wife. Morris worked for a grocery store and wasn't making very much a month, but he married Jenny. And I have 2 sisters, Harriet and Shirley. They made sure we went to the shore a lot. They made sure we were good in school. I remember going to school when we used to have to walk these long distances. And it was the Arlington School, I'll never forget it. When Dee and I got married and went on a honeymoon, we bought this camera to take pictures. It was a Wallensack Power Zoom. In those days, it was a good camera, but it's so heavy I can hardly lift it now. Today, they're so light and beautiful. When I was a child, I always had an interest in photography. In fact, I made a dark room out of cardboard when I was growing up in the basement. It was just magnetic to me, photography. It was just like magic. And in fact, I taught Steve quite a bit about it. And he won some awards at the Cheltenham Camera Club. We went out one Sunday with the kids and there was a strange looking bird. And I took a picture and I cut the negative out and made it all into black and white. That won an award. And there's a picture of Faye who fell roller skating and had black eyes. And that was an award. I had a lot of awards. I took a lot of pictures. And actually, later on, my secretary's husband was a carpenter. And I was so nice to her as a gift. He built me a wooden darkroom where we used to have a garage. And that was an unbelievable luxury for me. That's when everything was perfect. I would walk along and just take pictures of things and then look at them when they were developed. In fact, one of them, I looked out the window at my office, right where Steve is now at 22nd and Market. And I saw people crossing the street in shadows. And I took a picture of that, and that won an award. They were building a high-rise. And from my window, I was on the 4th floor then, I took a picture of a man in the mist welding a piece of steel. And that won an award too. Steve talked about having a go-kart. So I took and I went out and bought heavy, heavy lumber. I guess it was 1.25 inches pine. And I bought wheels and axles and everything and built him a go-kart that was really, really beautiful. But unfortunately, it had a hand brake. And Steve was going down the hill in Farriston Drive, and he pulled the brake, and it went over. And Faye got hurt, I think. She broke a tooth. She was in it. And Steve got hurt, but it wasn't serious. But I really enjoyed building that because Steve wanted it. And it was the kind of thing that I could work on with him. We had fun at Farriston Drive. Faye all this time loved music. She played guitar and she gave guitar lessons and she really kept herself busy. Steve played the drums. He was very good at the drums. Dee wasn't in music and I wasn't in music. So we never knew how the kids got into music. Faye could sing and Steve could sing. And that was very happy for us because neither one of us could sing. Faye went on to Wellesley and she majored in music for 4 years. And after she got out of Wellesley, she got a scholarship at Brandeis. And she was going to be a composer. Steve married Debbie and they had a child named Michael. And Danny and Jenny and Sherry. So we're very fortunate. We have 4 grandchildren, plus Justin, who I love a lot. Then Faye married, and she only had 1 child named David. They were very nice children. They still are, every one of them. first met my wife when my sister called me and said a good-looking Jewish girl came in the store today to buy some luggage for school, and I think you ought to take her out. So she gave me her, name and address, and I called, and I made a date. My brother-in-law and my sister took us out, and we went into a gay nightclub of all things. The entertainment was all gay men. My wife's reaction was really very muted. I thought she'd be very upset, but she wasn't. Remember, she was brought up in a small town, and she didn't really have a lot of experience, but we must have hit it off because I kept calling her after that. I was at BU Law and Dee was in Wellesley, which is about 20-some miles from each other. The theater then was a big, expensive thing, $2.20 a ticket. So we saw almost every single play that opened in Boston. After a few dates, her parents invited me on a Sunday for dinner. And Dee's mother was very formal, very, very formal. Her father was a wonderful, easygoing guy. So I went there by train, and Dee picked me up, and we had a very, very nice, elegant dinner, if I must say so. Dee's parents were in the grocery business. He had a fairly big store, and he did very well. My parents were, my father was a partner in a grocery store, and he worked very hard. It was a different kind of life. But both of them were in the grocery business. They came to visit me at BU Law. It was wonderful. We had a big old house somebody left at BU on Beacon Hill, which today would be worth literally millions. And it had about 4 living rooms, and we're sitting in one living room. And Dee's father said to me, he says, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but I guess you and Dee are very serious. I said, yes, we are. And I felt like a schmo. I should have asked him, but I didn't. He asked me. And then I went out and bought a ring after that. It wasn't really a very elaborate ring, but it was a ring. When I graduated law school, Dee had a final, and she couldn't come, and her mother came. And after graduation, she says, I think something's wrong with that program. I said, why? She says, your name is not listed in the law school graduates. I said, did you look up above? She said, no. I said, well, do it. And I graduated cum laude. So she, I think then she realized that I was legitimate. I went to the Army before I graduated, before I went to law school. Fort Eustis, Virginia. General Eisenhower was head of the Army, and there really wasn't very much for us to do. They started to let people out, and everyone wanted to get out right away. So you didn't have any choice. All of a sudden, I get a letter one day, I think it was a Saturday, that you weren't in the Army more than a year, or whatever this, I think it was a year, so that we were going to consider you for the draft again. And have you remarried? Have you married? No. So I went to Dee, I said, I don't want to go back in the Army. So I said, let's get married. Within 2 weeks, her mother got the whole thing put together. It was a very happy event. In Dee's house, she had a house with a big, tremendous yard. Neither one of us had really traveled the country, and we got a car as a gift. So we took and we decided to drive from Nashua to Illinois, where I had cousins who had a farm. On a Friday night, which I'll never forget, they opened the New Jersey Turnpike. And we were driving from wherever, maybe Philadelphia. We had friends in Philadelphia, but they opened the New Jersey Turnpike, and we were part of the first group that used it. We went to New York and had a nice dinner, and then came home. And I went to work for the grand sum of $15 a week in a one-man law firm. Then I decided after a while that I wasn't happy, and I applied to the federal government, but I got assigned to Philadelphia. Linwood Gardens had a long waiting list, and one of Dee's classmates' father had an interest in Linwood Gardens. So we called them, and that's how we got into Linwood Gardens. My wife was a very down-to-earth person. She liked to cook, she liked to bake, and one of the problems at the beginning of our marriage was she couldn't have children, and it took, 8-9 years till Stephen was born. And then we had Faye, my daughter. I spent a lot of time in the dark room. I would come home at night exhausted, and after dinner I would go down the dark room for an hour or two. She was very friendly with everyone. We made a lot of friends, especially. She made more friends in Philadelphia. And she worked door to door, getting people out to vote. And she liked that. She was very active, she was smart. When my children were young, we used to go visit my in-laws and my parents quite often. And it was an exciting trip because in a station wagon, the kids weren't quiet. Of course, Steve was the light of my life. He was always quick on the draw, even when he was a young kid. One time, he and Faye were playing when we were away, and I don't know what happened, but he ripped something in her knee, and that night I had to go to the hospital through a friend of ours and get Faye's knee opened up and fixed up. We used to go to visit either our in-laws or my parents, and Steve and his cousins. My mother used to make some of the Jewish dishes, and they liked some and they didn't like others. So I think the word they discussed is what they didn't like, they called snuggles or something. They had some word, and they would go into the toilet and throw it in and then flush it. I had a boss who was a very nice man, but Steve said something, I don't know, he said something to Steve jokingly, and Steve just got up and kicked him. Dee wanted to go back to school, and she went back and got her master's. I would describe the early days of my marriage as wonderful. Those were good years. I graduated from law school in 1950. After graduation, I worked for a lawyer, a one-man firm, for the grand sum of $15 a week. And I looked around and I applied and got a job with the Internal Revenue Service. The Criminal Tax Division evaluated investigations that the agents had labeled as criminal. One of the major cases I remember was a very big congressman from Jersey and decided that we ought to prosecute. And I guess it got to the national office, and they were a little nervous because this was a big congressman. The chief counsel came in, Lester Uritz, never forget him, wonderful man. And we met, and he listened to my presentation and said, go ahead. So that was a very, very big feather in my cap. And from then on, we got a lot of other cases, and I evaluated it. The new chief counsel was very, very, very conservative, wonderful man. One afternoon, he called me down to his office, and the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, Don Alexander, was in the office. And they said, we're going to assign you a case to handle personally. Because at that time, I was chief of criminal tax for all over the country. And he handed me a file, and I looked at it, and it was Richard M. Nixon. Well, as I was working on it, one Friday night, which I will never forget in my life, I got a call from the chief counsel. He said, can you come down? We're going to be busy tonight. You're coming with us. And he said, we're going to meet Leon Jaworski. I looked around the meeting, and first of all, I was the only non-presidential appointee. Everybody else in that room was appointed by Nixon. And here we are, ready to prosecute him. And who are they listening to? A non-Nixon appointee. And Jaworski came out, and he was a very, very affable Texan. And he says, tell me what you got. And I explained to him what we had. And that started the grand jury on Nixon. The investigation went on and on. There was a lot of loans and, quote, gifts from friends. But the grand jury didn't think it was strong enough to prosecute. If he had been prosecuted and convicted, he would have gone to jail.
Okay, at the time, what was your position with the Internal Revenue Service?
At that time, I was deputy chief counsel of the Internal Revenue Service. Those were the exciting years, because in addition to what I was doing, I was getting calls from our staff all over the country who had cases and wanted to discuss them and get opinions. The chief counsel of Treasury was a guy named Robert Mundheim. One afternoon he called and he said, Leon, come over, I'd like to talk to you. And he told me all about the Inspector General was to look at all kinds of fraud, abuse, criminals, any violation of internal rules and regulations. And then one afternoon I met Blumenthal. We talked about the job, and he said to me, would you like it? And I said, yeah. I mean, it's something exciting, something different. And I took that job and moved over to Treasury. And in that job, we handled soup to nuts. I mean, people who were crooked internally, people who were not doing what they're supposed to do. We even had a relative of the Carter family who was allegedly doing some improprieties. And it didn't, we investigated it, but it didn't work out. And I stayed in Treasury, and I liked it very much. I dealt with some, not many, but a few people in the White House. But one thing I'll never forget, I was called before a committee of Congress to discuss a case. And I figured this is hot enough. So I called the secretary. And he says, handle it the way you want it. And I said, well, I'll handle it the way it is. I'm not gonna. And I felt that we weren't getting guidance, but on the other hand, it was honest. No one told me what to say. No one told me how to say it. But there's one funny incident I remember being in the White House Treasury. Carter used to run around the track with his wife every day, probably in the afternoon. And since my office overlooked the White House, I used to be able to see him. And one day the telephone rang, and one of the Secret Service men, who I knew very well, said, "Leon, tell your secretary to get the hell off the window ledge with the ruler, because she may not live to tell about it." Because they wouldn't know whether it was a gun or who she was. They really watched everything when the president is out. We were literally an alleyway apart from the White House. And after Reagan was appointed, the next day, everyone's yelling, "Clean up your office quickly." Reagan got up in the White House and walked across the street and came to shake hands with people in Treasury. And I thought that was a very, very nice. He was a good-looking man, very tall and very, very affable. When I retired from Treasury and we lived in Bethesda, Maryland, I didn't know what I was going to do. So we moved back to Philadelphia, and I was just going to retire. And one day, a friend of mine who was a judge here in Philadelphia called me and said that I went to a meeting with the mayor, who was good, in Harrisburg, and he was telling me he's thinking of setting up an IG. And I gave him your name. I got a call from Good. And he said, "I've looked into you and I would like you to be my Inspector General." I said, "Well, I'm not so sure." I went down there, and of course I took the job. He was very persuasive. I was Inspector General of the city about 7 years, and I worked on cases from heads of agencies to inspectors who were taking a dime, as they call it in the trade.
There's an old saying, will it pass the smell test? Regardless of what code of ethics you have, regardless of anything, this won't pass the smell test, in my view.
And I'll never forget, an inspector came in and said, "You've got to do this, 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 this. But if you want to see me at 3 o'clock, we'll work it out." So we set it up with cameras and everything, and the inspector came to see him at 3, and the cop handed him the money. And they arrested him on the spot, and that was on Channel 6 all night. But I had like 250 or 260 arrests in my career at the city, so it was a big deal. There was a lawyer I used to work with in IRS, Clayton Underkoffler, and he was on the board at SEPTA. And he said, "Leon, I've been after SEPTA to get an Inspector General. And Lou Gambaccini from New Jersey was just hired to be the new general manager. I was offered the job. They were looking for any bribes for hiring and for purchasing. Like, we used to buy tons of coal and tons of oil. And to make sure that we got the best price, we wanted to make sure that it really was an open bidding. And my career in SEPTA was very good. I really enjoyed that. My one piece of advice to both my children and my grandchildren was to be ethical.